Hello.
Do we have audio? No. Wait. Yes, we do. Woo!
And then switch that back to thank you.
Oh, that's a very loud tap. Camera speeding. And does that look okay? And is that the right slide? It matches what is on the screen, so I'm gonna guess
Yes.
that's
That is the right
And
slide,
then are
yes.
you gonna
I will
capture
click
it?
through
Okay,
it.
amazing. And then do you have my presentation as well?
If you want to send it to me on Signal or whatever.
Can you just send it? Can I email it?
That works too.
What's
Same
your email?
Gmail, mmsaxtechm@gmail.com.
MMM. So, right, I got it.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, Kevin, I need you to sit here for the whole time. Just hold the chair really steady.
It's gotta work.
Got sound, no visuals. Wait, what?
We're up to 56,000 on our mutual aid fund.
Woo!
They got Austin Mutual Aid got $2 million after Storm Uri. And there's a Christian nationalist organization that a lot of people are donating to. That I don't think anyone's Googling what they're donating to, but they donated to it. Someone dropped like a GoFundMe in one of my videos that were going viral, and then people just gave money to it, and that wasn't like a real thing. Like people need to just Google what they're doing before they give money. It's a lot, yeah. Well, we got a call Friday. Yeah, we got a call Friday asking us to do the mutual aid fund because we're a 501c3, and there's a legal entity that will have control of the money. That's not the same thing as GoFundMe. We're good?
We're good.
Yay! I don't care. I stand by that statement.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being here and tuning in. I know people don't tune in anymore. I'm sorry. I'm from the 80s. People used to tune in. This is going to be a little talk about the Declaration of Independence, a document that apparently more than half of Americans have not read, even though it is inarguably one of the most significant philosophical and political statements in our history. So I'm Brian Register. I teach philosophy at Austin Community College, which means that I've had the chance to teach the ethics of political engagement a lot of times, and this is certainly a document that fits into that tradition. So I'm going to talk about mostly the ideas behind the Declaration. I'm going to skip kind of lightly over some of the specific causes that are mentioned in it. So I thought that we might start toward the end of it for a reason. Right? So here's our Declaration. Everybody has seen a picture of it, even if they haven't actually read it. And here's a passage that's down near the bottom of it. These united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. They're absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Notice how great that sounds if you put the cadences right. Right? The is and ought to be, the repetition of that. Right? Why would you bother doing that? And in fact, who wrote that? And you would think Thomas Jefferson, right? He's the author of the Declaration of Independence, adopted July 4th, 1776. Whoa. He did not write that. The person who wrote that was Richard Henry Lee, also of Virginia. And he wrote it and submitted it to the Second Continental Congress on June 7th, 1776. On June 7th, Lee suggested that the Congress adopt a threefold resolution: that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they're absolved from any allegiance to the British Crown, that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, is the first part; that it is expedient forthwith to take up the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, is the second part; and that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation, is the third part. They took up the Declaration first, but they took up all three of those at the same time. The second one eventuated in a treaty with France, not very much later, and they put a lot more effort into their treaty with France over the summer of 1776 than they had put into their Declaration of Independence in the spring of 1776. As for the plan of confederation, they didn't end up writing the Articles of Confederation until late 1777, and it was not adopted by the United Colonies, the United States, until 1781. our independence war was almost over before we had a constitution. And of course, we no longer have the Articles of Confederation. So, as a result of a long series or a train of usurpations, the colonies had come to agree gradually across 1775 and 1776 as British oppression had become more severe, leading ultimately, well, not ultimately, leading ultimately to the revolution, but leading penultimately to literal destruction of towns by ships at sea. Right, so there was a case in what is now Maine, what was at the time part of Massachusetts, where a British captain landed at, I think, Portsmouth in Maine, went to the town, said, "You're all rebels against the crown, and I'm going to destroy your town." And then he went back out to his ship, and then he did. He destroyed the town, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. They did not have the kind of cannon that you could use to fire back. Right, so that was a terrifying, terrorizing abuse of state power, and that was one of the things that had convinced an awful lot of colonists who previously had been more conservative on the question of revolution that independence was actually necessary. Across April and May of 1776, even states like Pennsylvania that had been very not particularly eager about independence were beginning to warm to the topic. The Continental Congress, it was 13 delegations, one from each state. Each one of the delegations had instructions from its home colony or its home state. Sorry, my computer keeps doing a strange thing. So they had debates amongst themselves. There were certain delegations who wanted to vote for independence, but their instructions did not allow them to do so. Finally, even Virginia sent instructions to its delegation, go ahead and start moving for independence. They sent that in May of 1776, and that is why Richard Henry Lee of Virginia submitted those resolutions. All right, so they appointed a committee of 5 people to take up this question. Now here is a painting that probably everybody has seen. This is not a painting of, well, this is a painting of the presentation of the Declaration by the 5 men on the committee who wrote it. This, by the way, is Richard Henry Lee. Right, so he's the guy who initially moved for independence in early June. Right, here we have Thomas Jefferson, tall. Benjamin, that's Benjamin Franklin, surly. John Adams, even surlier. And the other 2 members of the committee of 5 who were appointed to actually write this declaration. And I have to say that I wonder why they have so many British flags in the background. This was painted in the 18-teens. Took a long time because as the painter, the people in it, he would paint them into it. Right, and so there was a lot of backing and forthing about who was going to sit where and so forth. And this is John Hancock, presiding officer of the Second Continental Congress. We will see him again in a moment. Here's a list of who's whom in that picture. So notionally, the thing being depicted is the presentation of the draft that the Committee of 5, but mainly Jefferson, had composed in June. So that committee was appointed on June 12th, 5 days after the Congress had said, we're really interested in eventually voting about independence, but we need Pennsylvania, we need New York, we need some more information, we're not sure about this kind of a thing, let's push it off a little bit longer. But they knew that they were going to eventually do it, so they went ahead and appointed this committee to write the declaration that they would eventually vote on later on. Jefferson had a number of kind of immediate sources from which he was drawing. Not only the Lee resolution, which of course appeared in the Declaration verbatim, he had written himself a declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms. He'd written it just a year before. And it's worth bearing in mind that there had been armed combat occurring in the colonies for well over a year before we declared independence. You might think, wait, necessity of taking up arms? Was it really necessary to take up arms? Couldn't they have gotten 3.5% of the colonists to just boycott tea, refrain from paying their stamp taxes, something like that, and let that work? And the answer is no. the people from whom we derive the idea that 3.5% of the population resisting something will typically lead to its overthrow point out that in a war of secession, or a struggle of secession, nonviolent resistance literally never works. In no recorded instance could they find a nonviolent secession struggle successful. Violent secession struggles usually don't work either. The nonviolent ones persistently fail. Of course, the Founding Fathers did not have modern social science, but one wonders whether perhaps they had an inkling that trying to persuade people across an ocean by nonviolent resistance does not work very well, because you cannot get in their faces and make it clear to them that they're doing wrong. Jefferson had himself written the Constitution for the state of Virginia just a few months earlier. It wasn't adopted in general. His model for that had been a 1688 document from England. In 1688, the English had overthrown their Catholic king because he had a whole bunch of policies that they did not care for, one of which was simply toleration of Catholicism. They composed a lengthy document called the Declaration of Rights. And that document had a list of terrible things that King James II had done, and then a new constitution for England, and then a declaration of the rights of Englishmen. The same idea shows up in those three parts in Jefferson's Constitution for Virginia. For our country as a whole, it shows up as our Declaration of Independence, our Articles of Confederation, later Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. So that was also one of his sources. Fellow Virginian George Mason had written a Declaration of Rights for Virginia to hopefully be adopted into their constitution just a couple of months earlier. And again, it contained some of the language that appears in our declaration. So Jefferson was not pretending to create this document from his own genius. He said explicitly, this is an expression of the common sense of the American people. Right? Phrases are lifted explicitly from other documents. There was no concealment. There was no pretense that he was trying to be original. Right? It was being made clear and explicit. We've all been thinking this kind of thing for quite some time. There were dozens of earlier declarations of almost independence, or declarations saying we should probably become independent, or declarations that Congress should declare independence or something of the kind. And many of these documents have used very similar language to the language that Jefferson used. So, this committee of 5 was appointed on June 12. The two most firebrand members of it were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. John Adams had been calling very vociferously for a revolution for quite some time. He was from Massachusetts. Massachusetts is where the revolution started, because Massachusetts is where Boston is, and Boston was leading the resistance, and so it was also the most targeted for oppression. So its people were the most angry, and also puristic on the matter and willing to die over it. Virginia was actually relatively slow to get on board. Jefferson himself had been ahead of the Virginian curve. So Adams had already essentially written various declarative documents. So they kind of had a question, which of us is going to kind of do the main work? And Adams told Jefferson, everybody already knows what I think. So if I write this thing, everybody is going to go, oh my God, John, again? Why don't we have you do it? And Jefferson agreed. It was also agreed on all hands that Jefferson was a gifted writer. The Continental Congress was a federal government that had absolutely no staff whatsoever. On the same date that they appointed this committee of 5, they also had to vote as a body of 13 delegations of multiple members, pursuing unanimity among the 13 delegations, to pay the secretary. That was not some order of business taken care of by lower orders of the bureaucracy, because there was no bureaucracy. These people were sitting at their desks in the Continental Congress, patiently obeying Robert's Rules of Orders 12, 16 hours a day. It is not exactly clear when Jefferson found the time to write the Declaration of Independence, but he had 2 weeks to do it. He was appointed on June 12th, and he turned it in on the 28th, which is 16 days later. And you have to wonder how he felt about turning in the paper to the teacher, because that is very nearly what had happened. He, Adams, Franklin, and the other 2 members of the Committee of 5 were Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston, much less well-known figures. They had, of course, looked over it. Adams and Franklin especially had made a few suggestions. So Jefferson had taken pen to paper, and he had written something. Of course, the something that he had written didn't look like that. Right? For one thing, the something that he'd written didn't have any signatures on the bottom of it. Right? He certainly wasn't going to waste paper with a big... And of course, he didn't know when it was going to be adopted. This is not a handwritten document. This is a later printed document. Right? So he took and wrote on paper, and then he scratched things out as he didn't like them. Or as Adams or Franklin didn't like them. He would scratch them out and put other things in. He made a number of marks on it that were just very strange. Nobody really knew what they were there for. When the document was given to the printer, the initial printer just reproduced the marks, assuming that they had some significance that he did not grasp. Historians seem to think that Jefferson was putting notes on there about where to pause as he presented to the Continental Congress. And it was notes only for him, because the printer who prints things to be read aloud had never seen this kind of a thing before. He had no idea what was going on. Jefferson was known as not an exceptionally gifted speaker, so he was trying to make himself a little bit better, because apparently he knew he wasn't very good at it. So this is not a thing that Jefferson wrote, although we can definitely agree graphic design is someone's passion. It's just a wall of text. Right? This is not how we would write something. All right, so here we have Jefferson handing over a piece of paper to the presiding officer of the Continental Congress, John Hancock there. Right? Here's our group work. Hope we get an A. They did not. There it is. A little bit bigger. Signatures. Right? How did those get on there? These signatures were not added until substantially later. This is not the signatures of the people who are in that picture. It is not the signatures of the people who were in the room at the time. Of the people in the room at the time, some of them left Congress by the time anybody got to sign anything, and some people had joined Congress between the adoption declaration and the point at which anybody could sign it. Their names were added even though they hadn't ever been able to vote for or against it. Right? So this is a list of mostly people who were in the Continental Congress on the 2nd of August, 1776, a date known for nothing. Right? But they were collecting signatures for quite some time beforehand. They kept collecting signatures for several months afterwards. Each colony had its own area for its signatures. And because you didn't know how many people from the previous state were going to sign it, you had to leave space for just in case another New Yorker showed up. Of course, John Hancock, presiding officer of the Continental Congress, got to sign it front and center. And that's why, of course, asking for your John Hancock is how we ask for a signature. That might be a very obscure reference these days. All right, so what does it say? When in the course of human events. Now, Jefferson was not a public speaker, but he was a student of rhetoric, and he knew full well that this was a document to be read in public. In fact, immediately after the document was composed, they didn't send it to France. Right? The immediate objective of declaring independence was to show foreign governments, especially France, we're independent now, so if you take our side in our struggle with the British, you're not intervening in a British civil war. You'll be intervening in an international war, and that is legal and also in your interests. That was the reason that they did this. That's the reason that Lee's resolution listed declaration and treaties and a new government. Right? We already had 13 functioning governments. We already had a Continental Congress. We already had an army in the field. Right? So we didn't really need to do this, except insofar as we needed to make an impression on the rest of the world. Nevertheless, we didn't send it to France. From France's point of view, the fact that we were independent was enough. They didn't need the high-flowing rhetoric, and they had an absolute king who was not going to be remotely interested in their high-flowing rhetoric. Right? So the fact of independence was very significant for international affairs, but who they immediately sent this document to? Every state and every army. This was to be read to every group of soldiers. It was to be printed and handed out to random people who would then go into a bar and say, "Guys, you will not believe what happened. We're our own country now," and jump up on a table and read it. And even though Jefferson himself could not have pulled that off because he was a bad speaker, he knew that other people would need to. At some point in your life, get on a table and read this thing, like as if to a slightly drunken audience. When in the course of human event, course. All right, now, it's Central Texas. It's a week after we've had a lot of very bad flooding, so this is kind of a hard point to make at the moment. Course, that means a river and not a slow one, right? That means the tide of human events, and it means a rapid motion, right? Stuff is happening, and it's not just in the rivulet of local affairs. When in the course of human events, something is necessary, right? And it isn't just our events, it's human events. We're talking about like the species as a whole, right? We're talking about humanity itself. It becomes necessary. We're not really making a choice here. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people, right? When did that people come into being? With this document. Right? At what prior moment had there been a united colonial people? Never. The colonies had barely had any relationships with one another, politically speaking. Each one of them had related immediately back to the British government. Right? So they conjured themselves into being as a people by saying that they were doing so, by putting it up the flagpole and everybody saluting. It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth, again, the scale, right? This is a large event that is occurring. The separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. They sent that to soldiers. Why would you send that to soldiers? Because they were underpaid, underfed, and underarmed. And a little bit of high-flown rhetoric once in a while will sometimes remind you that you are actually fighting for something other than the next yard on the battlefield. Right? This was intended as an inspirational document. Right? It was hardly the only such document. Right? So Thomas Paine's Common Sense had come out in January, but it was a bit long to be read as a single speech. But read that at some point, like aloud, angrily, firmly, right? And get the cadences right. All right, so that we apparently are a people, we are assuming among the powers of the earth a separate and equal state. That didn't have quite the same ring to it that it has after Plessy v. Ferguson, by the way. The laws of nature, oh wow, the causes which impel them to the separation. All right, so that's what this document is going to be. And now we have this extremely famous sentence. And it is one sentence. Now, the way that Jefferson wrote this sentence, the way that the Second Continental Congress wrote the sentence, the way that the sentence was printed in various broadsheets, and the way that it was printed in various other broadsheets were all a little different, right? So this is one of several versions that showed a little bit of difference, right? But we get 5 claims. Right? Again, you saw the passion for graphic design at the beginning, block of text. We can break this one up in a slightly more modern format. Right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Jefferson wrote inalienable. Apparently the copy that I was copying from on the internet corrected it to unalienable. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. What does any of that mean? Well, I've underlined the key terms. All right, self-evident. Self-evident doesn't mean obvious. All of calculus is self-evident. All of mathematics is self-evident. If you just understand the proof and the equation of the formula, you immediately know it to be true. Whether you understand it or not is a very different question. Right? I understand very little math. It's still self-evident. It's not self-evident to me, but it's not evident to me at all. These truths are self-evident, and that doesn't mean these truths are obvious or that everybody gets them or something like that. It means that once you understand them, you believe them. With most of the claims that we make the claim, you can understand the claim, and then you can go looking for evidence for or against the claim. Right, so right now, I can make the claim, I am in a library. I can understand that claim. And then, if I start kind of blinking and then I see my bedroom, I will have evidence against the claim that I had understood a moment before. And by the way, as a professor of philosophy, you present an argument about how you might be dreaming so many times that eventually when you're giving it, you do get kind of a dreamlike sensation. Right? So I can understand the claim that I'm in a library and then go looking for evidence for or against it. The evidence for it right now is I remember walking in, it looks like a library, I've been here before, things like that. And I understand what evidence against it would be. If the walls were to suddenly fall apart and I were to discover that I was really in an FBI lab or something like that, okay, well that would be evidence, would show me that I hadn't actually been in a library. These truths aren't like that. There's no space between grasping the meaning of these truths and believing them. Once you grasp the meaning, you believe them. That is what it is for something to be self-evident. It doesn't mean obvious. If it were obvious, it wouldn't need to be pointed out. Right? I mean, they are trying to do something that they understood to be new in human affairs. Right? That means that it wasn't obvious to everybody that you should do this, otherwise everybody would have done it 10,000 years ago. So that is what the self-evident means. Think about these. You'll get them. But if you haven't thought about them, if you have refused to think about them, if you've been willfully dishonest about them, if you're somebody's king, probably you don't get them. All men are created equal. That's our sentence, right? That's our country, in one sentence, ideally. All means all. That is a word in English. It has a clear, straightforward, direct meaning. There is no question about the meaning of that word. So you think, Thomas Jefferson, complicated person, rapist, racist, author of Declaration of Independence. All right, so if you were to ask Thomas Jefferson, if you were to ask him, what mental image do you, Thomas, have when you think of all men? What do the men look like? And ask him, could you sketch them, please? Because he was quite a skilled artist. He would sketch white men. Okay. That doesn't change the meaning of the word all. The word all means all, no matter what mental images you form right before thinking it. Okay. There's a 20th century philosopher of language, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who puts this point in, I think, a really elegant way. He says, say it's hot in here, but mean it's cold in here. You can't do it, right? Even if you run through your mind pictures of Hoth or Antarctica or something like that, as you say, it's hot in here. Even though you're thinking, you're trying to form mental images of coldness, even if you do it so hard that you get a chill, your words still mean it's hot in here. Right? So no matter who Jefferson had in his mental imagery, as he wrote the word all, he meant all. It's not a psychological fact about the guy, right? It's a public social fact about the language. It means all. Men was generally understood to be gender neutral at the time. Right? It wasn't really until the 80s or 90s that most people realized that technically that word might be gender neutral, but in reality it's kind of got a vibe, right? Which you can tell by the oddness of saying to a gynecologist, your patient, this man is now here, sounds odd, right? Technically correct, sounds very, very weird. That does mean everybody, right? Created equal. Equal in what sense? And people have since 1776 been pointing out we're obviously not equal. What are you talking about? Well, we are in a certain way. We're social beings. It is our nature to be social. What that means is that we need to all be different. If we were the same, what would be the point in there being multiple members of the species? We wouldn't actually agglomerate in a society if we didn't have different contributions to make. And so the very fact of our sociology guarantees our diversity and makes it necessary for us to be diverse so that we can take advantage of one another. But I don't mean that in a cynical way. I mean so that we can get use out of being social beings. Yeah, that sounded awkward. But there are ways in which we don't need to be different. We all need to be able to speak. A social grouping, only some members of which could speak, wouldn't be a very effective social grouping. So when it comes to the ability to communicate, we do need to be actually pretty much the same. Some people can be a little bit wittier, or a little bit more eloquent, a little bit more seductive than other people. Some of us have a way with words, others not have way. But even people who are not exceptionally gifted with language are still able to get their point across, sometimes with a little bit more effort. That is a way in which we do have to be actually pretty much equal. We don't have to be equal when it comes to our ability to do Einstein-level physics, but when it comes to being able to basically communicate with most other people about ordinary affairs, we have to be the same. Moreover, we all have to be able to run our own lives. A society, some members of which relied on others to make every decision for them, would be a deeply malfunctioned society. So when it comes to those central abilities, the ability to communicate with others and to make decisions on your own, we have to be roughly on a par with one another. Some people are a bit more foresighted, some people are a bit more sensitive, some people are a bit more deliberative or intentional, but fundamentally, everyone can make their own decisions. What it is to say that we are equal is to say that it is very unusual for there to be a person who is not best suited to run their own life. You and I are unequal in an awful lot of ways, but neither one of us is better suited than the other to run our own lives. I am better suited to run my own life than anybody else, because I'm the only one who understands what means anything to me, what benefits me, what kind of a person I am. I'm a person who has a very natural interest in his own well-being, and that's true for everybody. That's the sense in which we're equal. We're all equally capable of directing our own lives. So we are equal in that sense, right? There are extreme cases, right? There is a small portion of the population sometimes best helped in certain parts of their lives, but fundamentally everyone, at least the overwhelming majority of us, are better suited to run our own lives than anyone else is. That is the sense in which we are equal. And we have to be because we're social beings. All right. Created equal. Well, we got here somehow. Jefferson had never heard of evolution. Right? Now, he certainly did have long traditions of people talking about nature creating us in a certain way. With nature understood sometimes as a person, sometimes as God, sometimes as just what nature really is. These concepts were used more or less indiscriminately for a very long time. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. So how does this endowment work, and what is this Creator? Well, okay, obviously the Creator is God. What does that mean? Very few of the people in that picture were what we would think of as Christians exactly. Right? Jefferson himself was a deist. That is, he thought that there was some kind of superlative reason behind the universe that made some things work, and that was about it. He had his own version of the Bible. He cut out all the miracles. Right? So he thought there was this Jesus guy, and he was a nice guy, and he said some nice things, but there was no virgin birth, there was no walking on water. The miracles didn't happen. Those would violate the laws of nature. Those would be unnatural, nasty, diabolical, something like that. But he told everybody to be nice to one another, and that seems like a worthwhile thing to say. Others of the founders were even less religious than that. Among philosophers, we distinguish between what we call the God of the philosophers and the God of the ordinary believer. The God of the philosophers is a very abstract kind of a thing. Right? It's something that created the universe in an orderly way. And that's about it. Past that, you get into what ordinary believers have in a specific religious tradition. Those founders who did believe that there was a God mostly didn't believe that that God was a person with attitudes, but rather that it was simply the intelligent and thoughtful source of nature and order. Not exactly a person. A little person-like, but not particularly a person. How did our Creator endow us with this? All right, well, these rights are all expressions of the fact that we are equal. And we are equal because we are social beings. So we are endowed with these rights by being us. It's not that there are people and they don't have rights, and then, bing, they have rights. Rather, people have rights because they're people. It is in our nature to have these rights. In his draft, Jefferson wrote, inherent and inalienable, right? Conveying that you can't really imagine a person without imagining their rights. It's intrinsic to human beings that we have those rights. What is it for them to be unalienable? Well, we do have alienable rights. Right? I own my car. That means that I have the right to sell my car. That is, I have an alienable right to the use of my car. I can alienate that right for considerations or none at all. And so I can sell it to somebody and give it away. My right to my car is alienable. I can separate it from myself. My right to speak freely, these rights that are listed here, those are inalienable. You cannot sell them for any consideration. Because what is left over, if you have something without rights, isn't a person, and you can't sell your personhood. It's inalienable. That's what it is to be endowed with inalienable rights. You have these dignities, whether anybody likes it or not. They cannot be taken from you. It isn't that they shouldn't be. They cannot be. That there is no force on earth that can do it, because we're talking about metaphysics, not pushes and pulls. All right. Now, what is it to have a right? The word have is kind of an ambiguous word, right? So you can say, I have a bottle of water. How many things do I have? One thing. Right? I have a bottle of water, glasses. How many things do I have? 2 things. I have a bottle of water, glasses, and the right to speak freely. How many things do I have? And it's still 2 things. Right? If you take my bottle of water away and obliterate it, I am still here and it is gone. Right? So there's 2 separate things, and there's a relationship between us, the relationship of having. But you can't separate me from my right to speak freely in the same kind of a way. It isn't a thing that exists independent of me, nor do I exist independent of it. If you get rid of me, my bottle of water is still there. Somebody else can pick it up, and now they have it. If you get rid of me, my right to speak freely does not drop to the ground and cannot be picked up by somebody else. You got rid of it at the same moment that you got rid of me. So what it is to have a right is not that there's a kind of a possession out of the world that could in principle be taken from you or something like that. You simply have a certain moral status. Right? You are berighted, we might say. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, we got plenty of them, but among them are those. That is the right not to be killed. It is the right not to be enslaved. And it is the right not mostly to be told what to do. And that will encompass the acquisition and deployment of material goods. The phrase life, liberty, and property had been in use for a very long time. Jefferson didn't use that classical phrase. He wrote this life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is because he was a little less interested in the accumulation of property for its own sake and a little bit more interested in the general idea of human well-being. Right? He philosophically had learned a lot from the Epicureans, who regarded happiness as the sum total of human well-being. So, for him, the reason to be free is so that you can pursue happiness, which does include property, but is not limited to it. Whereas many other writers will sometimes use the word property as if it were what it is to be well off. Right? So if you read like Jane Austen, somebody getting married is sufficient for their happiness. And at a certain point you realize she's not saying if you marry a rich guy, hopefully that'll work out in the end. No, if you marry a rich guy and you've got money, that's it. That's what happiness is. It's having the money. Right? So property sometimes has been used to mean happiness, but of course it also has a much narrower meaning. Jefferson didn't want to be misread on that, so he used the broader, richer phrase, pursuit of happiness. All right. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. What's the alternative? What's the point in pointing that out? Like, where else would somebody have thought governments came from? God, right? People had been saying for a very long time, government comes from God. God sends kings among us. And that is not the case, Jefferson is saying. Governments are instituted by us. We make governments. Government is a tool or artifice that a people creates to achieve various goals. The people exists independent of the government. Right, so, to secure these rights, so for a specific purpose, we make governments. And those governments only get to do anything because of the consent of the governed. If we withdraw our consent, they don't have just powers anymore. All right? And that kind of implies the last point, the pertinent one under the circumstances of declaring independence, whenever any form of government, like the one we're here to complain about, becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So we got the hook up back to the original right here. This is the active part of this. Because this is a declaration of independence, they're saying, we're going to be exercising this right now. That's what this piece of paper is us doing. We're not doing this casually. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. When a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce us under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. Now, I didn't get the cadence is quite right on that, but if you read it correctly, it's really quite moving to your slightly drunken audience. Right? So, if you're patient, if you're prudent, which we have been, right, we're not flipping out over nothing. Right? A long train of abuses and usurpations. And it's not accidental, right? Pursuing invariably the same object. Right? The guy isn't just kind of incompetent and mean sometimes. He is apparently working on the project of being a tyrant. All right, such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies. And that is the necessity which constrains them, leads us to, causes us to alter our government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny. This isn't your regular bad governance sort of issues. Right? This isn't regular connivance, bad behavior on the part of leaders. And then immediately, the rhetoric has gotten very high there. And then he gives this list, right? So he says, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then he starts the list with, he has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. That's not very high-flown rhetoric. And it also doesn't really sound like abuses or usurpations or having any direct object at all. I mean, he hasn't let us pass some laws. That's what are you talking about? And indeed, commentators at the time wanted to know what that even meant. Like, which laws in particular are you talking about, Jefferson? Or, Committee of Five. Apparently, historians don't know what some of these things even mean. So you look at that and go, why did you do that? Right? You had the rhetoric up to a certain high pitch, and then you suddenly dropped it. But then notice what happens across the long train of abuses and usurpations as we read them. They get bigger, right? You got to build to a crescendo from something, right? So in a rock song, you have the bridge. That's what this is. Right? This is what moves us from the high-flown rhetoric from one sentence previous to the high-flown rhetoric we're going to have a few abuses later. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. I'm not going to read all of these. He's dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions. He's endeavored to prevent the population of these states. Some of these are specific. Apparently, the parts of the royal government in charge of giving new land to new colonists had started charging outrageous fees, thereby essentially preventing people from emigrating to the colonies. He's obstructed the administration of justice by refusing assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Apparently there had been a number of cases in which he had prevented the colonists from appointing their own judges. Now we start getting much worse. He's erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers. Right? So the good people of Massachusetts kept complaining about the tax collectors as if they were a biblical plague of locusts, so a literal swarm. It was a swarm of about 50, by the way, which is not a particularly serious swarm, but to eat out their substance. He's kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. That one's a little bit harder, right? I mean, that's not just regular bad governance. It's like, could you get out of my house and stop just being weird soldiers in public all the time? He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. Right? Those standing armies, when they shot people, were then taken back to England for a trial. They were not put on trial in the relevant jurisdiction. They were certainly not going to be found guilty in England. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. This weird conspiratorial language, but the others were Parliament. Jefferson and many of the other founders had the theory that the colonies were never subject to Parliament, that they were parts of the British Empire, but not parts of Britain. Right? So they're saying, look, the king has done all of these things, but he has also gotten together with Parliament to do these other things. The Parliament doesn't have anything remotely resembling a legal right. And so that's subject to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. Parliament, the English Parliament, representative of the English voters, that was foreign to their constitutions. And you might think, wait, foreign to our Constitution? What Constitution do we have? The Articles of Confederation aren't going to be signed for 5 years. What is our Constitution? And it is singular Constitution, right? So it isn't even 13 constitutions, one per colony, right? Most of which, by the way, were only a few months old or hadn't been written yet as of when Jefferson was composing this. So what is our Constitution? It was the unwritten customs and traditions by which the colonists have always governed themselves. Constitutions are not inherently written down. Right? The founders will all have read Aristotle's Politics, and Aristotle says that the constitution of a civil society is just the way in which it governs itself. You might or might not write down part of the way in which you govern yourself, so you might or might not happen to have a written constitution, but still, the colonists have had ways of doing things, and Parliament telling them what to do was not part of those. And then, by giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, right, as if I were to try to pass a law for like Germany or Brazil, just pick a random country, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. Right? So there were cases in which colonists had been just found guilty by a military court of the English. Right? There's nothing in any English tradition would make that okay. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. Apparently this never actually happened, but Parliament did pass a law saying the colonists can be brought to England for regular criminal trials. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province. This had to do with a whole bunch of legal affairs in Canada. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. So Parliament had passed a law saying that they were the representative body, the legislative body of the colonies, despite having no representatives from the colonies in it. And that was their phrase, in all cases whatsoever. Right? So they were saying, look, we just run you, like, in every imaginable way. What are you people complaining about? He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war on us. Again, that was the king's words. Right? The king had given a speech not too long earlier in which he declared the colonies out of his protection. He declared the colonies a free fire zone, and then he used that. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. And that's where it should have stopped. Right? Because the next one's just weirdly out of place, right? Because that is a lot, right? I mean, totally unworthy. Like, you can't get angrier than that. Right? He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country. Right? So the British had said, look, if you're trading without our permission, we're going to enslave you, put you into our navy, and then you're going to have to kill other Americans. It's not clear whether they ever did that, but they said that they had the right to. That's very bad, but it should have been before this. Right? This should have been the last thing. This is good, but it should have been before that. All right. And you can see what's on the bottom of the screen. Right? So this has been relatively celebratory up to this point. This is the last grievance. This is the disappointing one. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. Domestic as in, you know, the members of our household to whom we are not genetically related. Right? I mean, enslaved people. Right? So he has excited domestic insurrections among us. So the royal governor of Virginia had said, hey, if you're enslaved, we'll emancipate you and pay you if you will come join our British Army. That was the complaint. That was the domestic insurrection. About 5,000 people did that. And good for them. Do you know what that regiment of black British troops was then sent to do immediately after the American Revolution? Put down a slave revolt in Jamaica. Right? So the king had not liberated them out of moral considerations. Right? But still, you can hardly complain. Anybody who does anything to liberate someone from slavery is very hard to complain about. And has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. Cool, bro. I mean, and this is not defensible. Right? I'm not going to try. I mean, sure, that was the known rule of warfare. It was also the white people's known rule of warfare. Right? So you can say, I mean, you were supposed to be on our side. It's not a moral question. You're just supposed to be our protector, not their protector. So could you get back to protecting us? Oh, no? Well, then we'll just protect ourselves. So as a journalistic point, fair enough. As a moral point, it lacks something. All right. Excited domestic insurrections among us. Jefferson. Come on. Actually, that's probably not what you called him. Thomas. Tommy. What'd you do that for? Did you not read? Like, it's not even 5 pages ago on your version. It's on the same piece of paper. You wrote all men. All right. He has excited domestic insurrections among us is what is in the Declaration of Independence as agreed to by Congress. This is what was there before Congress got at it. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms against us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. That's a better ending. And you'll note the tone, right? That's worthy of this paragraph here. Oh, no, not that one. No, this one, yeah. That's worthy of this, right? Those are moral high points, right? There's a passion, there's a justified righteous anger in both of those. Where'd that go? Way down south. So as Jefferson, slave owner, didn't want to be in a certain way. And you think, well, wait, wasn't he in charge? Kind of. Emancipated slaves in Virginia had to leave the state almost immediately upon being emancipated. There was a large sum of money that had to be paid to the state government before they could be emancipated. So it is arguable that Jefferson might have done a little bit more emancipating had he been in better financial shape. He spent his entire life in debt. George Washington was better at business. He emancipated most of the people that he enslaved. Right, so the ones that were part of his own personal property that he had not married into, he emancipated them at least upon his death. Jefferson did not do that despite saying all the right things. He was a better writer than he was a person, maybe. But he was a better writer. This is part of his Notes on the State of Virginia, which he wrote 3 years later. He was actually writing this across the 1770s. So this is just his book about Virginia. He loved Virginia. He was later governor. Actually, I think at the time that he wrote this, he might have been governor of Virginia. So he talked about some legal proposals that had recently been made by him and a few other people to emancipate all slaves born after passing the act. So they had written proposed legislation to end slavery in Virginia. The bill reported by the revisers, that's him and a couple of his friends, does not contain the proposition to, right, so we handed a piece of proposed legislation and we handed an amendment to it. Right? So it was given to them, they could have thought about it. So an amendment containing it was prepared to be offered to the legislature whenever the bill should be taken up, and further directing that they, the children of enslaved people, though they wouldn't be enslaved because they're born after that date, so they're emancipated, should continue with their parents to a certain age, then be brought up at the public expense to tillage, farming, arts or sciences, according to their geniuses. Now, genius didn't quite mean the same. It just meant your natural gifts, right? So someone might have a genius for putting Legos together. It's not necessarily very complimentary, but still it is your natural gift or talent, right? To farming, Jefferson thought farming was kind of the highest vocation of human beings, right? So to tillage, arts, and sciences, it's not outstandingly vicious in its racism. Then be brought up at the public expense. Right? That's 1779 slavery reparations. According to their geniuses, till the female should be 18, the males, that is males, I typed it wrong. Males, 21 years of age, when they should be colonized to such places the circumstances of the time should render most proper. This is not ever going to work. This is totally unrealistic. Notice who it does and doesn't benefit if it had worked. Colonized to such places the circumstances of the time should render most proper, sending them out with arms, implements of household and the handicraft arts, seeds, pairs of the most useful domestic animals, etc., to declare them a free and independent people. That's the same thing that Jefferson was doing for the colonies back in the Declaration, declaring that we are a free and independent people, right? And he's doing that on behalf of our human nature and our general excellence and significance and dignity. He says, look, let's take all of these black people around here and just, they can be their own free and independent people. Right? You think, well, wait a minute. Why not just around here then? Not free and independent individuals, but a free and independent people. All right, and yeah, we're going to get new white people to take their jobs. It will probably be asked, why go to all that trouble? Why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state, and thus save the expense of supplying by importation of white settlers the vacancies they will leave? That is the least of the reasons to ask that question. Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites. If we have a whole bunch of black people in our society, we're going to be too racist, and it's going to be awful. 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained. We have been so vicious that no one could forgive us. The new provocations, that's really vague. Disappointing. The real distinctions which nature has made Don't like that part. And many other circumstances. What does that mean? All right, the real distinctions. So in the text, he has a couple of pages of, here are the ways in which white and black people are similar and different. Whether further observation will or not verify the conjecture that nature has been less bountiful to them in the endowments of the head, that's his racism. I believe that in those of the heart she will be found to have done them justice. Okay. Remember those self-evident truths? They're not self-evident because you're smart. They're self-evident because you're human, because you have the capacity for sentiment and respect. Right? In every important way, Jefferson is saying here, white and black people are actually equal. Okay? The opinion that they, black people, are inferior in the faculties of reason and imagination must be hazarded with great diffidence. Right? So, 1770s, the guy is saying, we seem to have some evidence for some kind of an IQ gap, but I don't know, man. We should probably think about that. Which is not the best thing a person can say on the question of race, but isn't the worst either. And then he continues. Hey, you know how people keep saying that black people are criminals? That disposition to theft with which they have been branded must be ascribed to their situation and not to any depravity of the moral sense. The man in whose favor no laws of property exist probably feels himself less bound to respect those made in favor of others. When arguing for ourselves, we lay it down as a fundamental that laws, to be just, must give a reciprocation of right. That without this, they are mere arbitrary rules of conduct founded in force and not in conscience, heart, right? And it is a problem which I give to the master to solve, whether the religious precepts against the violation of property were not framed for him as well as his slave, and whether the slave may not as justifiably take as little from one who has taken all from him as he may slay one who would slay him. Not the worst sentiment. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it. For man is an imitative animal. The man must be a prodigy within the prodigal son, as very unusual, who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. Right? I mean, he's saying slavery is making us depraved. And with what execration should the statesman be loaded who, permitting one half the citizens thus to trample on the right of the other half of the citizens? Right? Now, I'm not saying that Jefferson in that passage was trying to attribute citizenship in some kind of full-scale sense to African Americans, but he certainly wasn't denying a fundamental equality. Right? So this is at worst casual wording. Thus, to trample on the right of the other transforms those into despots and those into enemies, destroys the morals of the one part and the amor patriae, the love of country, of the other. For if a slave can have a country in this world, it must be any other in reference to that in which he is born to live and labor for another. It's hard to do better than that. Right? For a person who did not follow through in his personal life or in his political life, the man could say some things. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God? Right? If you don't think that our liberty is natural, if you think that our liberty is the result of conventions or laws, then you might just come up with a different convention or law. So it's really important that we all acknowledge that all men are created equal, because if we don't acknowledge that all men are created equal, at some point you're going to be one of the people who somebody else treats as not created equal. All right. That is the excursus on Jefferson's racism. Right? So we have this really complicated, hideous legacy. Right? So imagine that you got a message from your parents. Like that you were an orphan and you got a message from your parents. And that you only got half. The second half was garbled, confused. You got the first half, and it told you to be a good person. And you committed yourself to living by your parents' ideals as you understood them, and as you understood them, it was to be a good person. Right? And then, later, you get the other half of the message, and it tells you to be a terrible person. At that point, you have to decide which part of the message to pay attention to. Right? Jefferson, in his own life, right running through the Declaration, has both of these parts. Right? Lincoln has the famous, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation conceived in liberty. That isn't true. Right? There's two nations around here. Right? One of them is conceived in liberty. The other one is slavery. It's never gone away. I mean, it changes its forms, but white supremacy has not gone away. We get to decide whether we're going to be the Jefferson of the all men are created equal part, or the Jefferson of the vile scientific pseudo-scientific racism, or what we want to be. Right? The equipment is here. The ideas are here. They've been in our history the whole time. It is gullible and naive to say America has always been consistently dedicated to the good. It is cynical and nihilistic to say that we have always been consistently committed to evil. We've been of two minds the whole time. So we need to decide which of those countries will actually be born. Back to the Declaration. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. Notice how important this is, and to have it near the end. Right? We have been telling you this stuff before King. Like, we're not bringing this up all of a sudden. Like, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So we're done with you. And you're not the only one we're done with. We haven't just petitioned the king, which they had done over and over and over again. They had kept telling the people of England, could you guys elect a different parliament? Could you impose upon the king to stop oppressing us? And we have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, so we've appealed to them just as human beings. We have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred. Right? So they're not just people, they're supposed to be our people, but that doesn't work. And then this is a fun word, consanguinity. Nobody says that word anymore, but the sang means blood. It's sameness of blood. Right? They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in necessity. Again, necessity, which has been operating the entire time, which denounces, that didn't mean condemns, it meant announces. Our separation, we hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We therefore, the representatives, notionally the signers at the bottom, not exactly those signers, we appeal to reason incarnate for the rectitude of our intentions. We claim the right to do all of the things that free and independent states can do. In support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honors. Honor was a very significant concept in the 18th century. People were very inspired by ancient Roman republicans. Cicero was a major figure. The most commonly performed play in the colonies across the entire 18th century was a play by an Englishman named Addison. It was called Cato, and it was about the attempt to preserve the Roman Republic from the Caesarian conspiracy, the effort by Caesar and some of his co-conspirators to overturn the Republic and make Caesar president essentially for life. That was a model of virtue. So the concept of sacred honor is not showing up here as a piece of empty rhetoric. This was a powerful moral appeal to people at the time and place. And that is about all I know about the Declaration of Independence. I got several books to put this together because I've been teaching this for a long time, and of course you always know there's plenty more to know. And so I read some of these books. You know what I found out? I found out I knew way less than I thought that I did. That is what you always find out, and probably should find out. So they started debating that document on July 2nd. Right, but first they did adopt Lee's resolutions. Right, so on July 2nd, 1776, they adopted Lee's resolution for independence, an alliance with France, and to compose a constitution. On July 3rd, John Adams wrote this to his wife. The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore. But it took them 48 hours as about 50 people to edit that document into the, in some ways better, in some ways not so much better, document that we all know and have mixed feelings about today. So we got it wrong by 2 days, but he is describing our annual 4th of July celebrations, which are sometimes very, very challenging depending on who's in office. There you go. There's your Declaration of Independence. I think that Sophia's going to say a few things about it. This should. There we go. All right.
Thank you very much.
There's nothing weird at the top. Okay.
Okay.
I just want to make sure there are no messages we're going to talk about.
Let's have another round of applause for Brian. And I will take the space because it's very inspiring.
I'm having trouble getting your slides to show the file's too big.
The file's big. Yeah, it's okay.
If you want to come and log
Just
in
put
real
up the
quick.
website.
Okay.
It's fine. Okay, so we're switching over to a page on our website, handsoffcentraltx.org/civics. There's also a page /electeds where you can find out who works for you, who is your elected representative working for you in office. I'm going to talk really briefly, we've got another half hour, about what it means to self-govern, because the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, if you read that, are very clear about our right to self-govern, right? It's extremely clear that government is derived from the consent of the people, meaning if we stop giving consent, government loses its power, right? Because like we know a lot in our interpersonal lives, in our jobs, if you stop going to work or listening to your boss, the boss's power is gone. And it's very similar for government. If we stop paying taxes, if we stop participating in government, if we stop allowing those who are currently in office to function the way that they want to, then our government will collapse. And as I think you could say, it is collapsing. And we very clearly have the right to self-govern. We very clearly have the right to reorganize our government. And so I'm going to talk about what that means, self-governance. So self-governance means that we participate in our government. There's a lot of ways to participate with the government. A lot of people think about voting as the primary and sometimes singular way that we participate in government, but there's a lot more, right? What? There's a lot more. We've got paying taxes. We have, of course, registering yourself and everyone you know to vote, and then voting not just in the federal election where we basically elect a CEO every 4 years, but rather every single local election, school board, county elections, sheriff, state, and city, municipality, like all the things, right? Because there's a lot of people who we're giving our tax money to run various levels of government, and if we don't govern them, then they're just going to do whatever they want, and sometimes that's not a good thing. So we have here in Texas, we've got our counties, we've got our cities, we've got the state. We've got the state, and the state just wrapped up. They have the Texas Legislative Session.
The library closes in 30 minutes. The computers will shut off in 20 minutes, and the meeting rooms and restrooms will close in 15 minutes.
Thank you, library. Okay, so we have the state government, which every year and a half has a 6-month section of time where they fast track thousands of bills. We need to work on the process. It's extremely hectic, but they also have the ability to call a special session. So I want to bring to everyone's attention that there's a special session that starts on July 21st. There's a little bit of information about it on our website. We will put more up on the civics page. And we need to keep this in mind because, as Brian mentioned, here in Texas we've had catastrophic flooding. And one of the reasons why it was so catastrophic to life and the safety of our neighbors is because grants are needed for counties and municipalities to install early warning systems of a reasonable standard of technology and efficacy. And what that means is, basically, we have a petition on our website, please go sign it for HB 13, and we'll send out notifications. The special session of the state doing governance starts on the 21st of July. We're going to need everybody, if you haven't already gone to the state capitol and participated in government at the state level, to figure out how to do it. You can always message us, you can always email us, and you can always go to the website. We will be sending out calls to action to go speak for or against specific legislation that reflects our Constitution, because that's our whole thing. And I'll talk really briefly about the Constitution before we roll ourselves up. And we'll talk more about this in subsequent Know Your Rights trainings. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's the beginning, the preamble. And they're talking about we're creating this Constitution to do these things. Now, I think right now, and for our entire history, as Brian talked about, we have failed to uphold the moral standards that we imagine for ourselves as a country. And part of the reason why we've been failing to uphold it is because the vast majority of Americans do not participate in government as much as they could, right? We don't call our representatives every single day. We don't email them every single day, every single week. We don't go down to City Hall, to the school board, to the county, or to the state and govern our employees. And we need to be doing that. And that's kind of our whole thing, right? Not just as organizers and activists, but as Americans. We have a civic duty to go down and to tell people what to do with the money that we give them from our paychecks, and what to do with the salaries, the staffers, and the electeds that we pay. So we have a lot of rights that are outlined in the Constitution, and you can go onto the website and read the Declaration of Independence, you can read the Constitution, you can read the Texas Constitution, which is shorter and in some ways sweeter, and you can also read the laws. I mean, I think this is a really important thing for people to read the criminal code in Texas, because there's a lot of laws that you might not be aware of, and all laws can be changed. So if you don't like something, you can write legislation to change it, and that's really important. We have the law and the inalienable right of free speech. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the part where there's a separation of church and state. Or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. Like, very obviously, not all of our constitutional rights are respected by every power of government or by every employee of government, whether that be the president or a sheriff or a legislature or an individual. And what that means is it's so important to know the laws so we know when our employees are breaking the laws. Civil rights. As citizens, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. That's everybody. Everybody that's born on American soil or naturalized. And we basically can vote. Now, we do take away the right to vote from felons in different ways for different lengths of time in different states. That's a huge problem, because if we take away the right to vote from any person, that violates representation in government, because they're not able to represent themselves through voting. And the right to vote is for citizens age 18 or older and shall be not denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of age. And the rights of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So that's really important, because that is more of that equality that we heard about in the Declaration of Independence. We also have a right to equality in various parts of the Constitution. Constitutional amendments have been added to make sure more and more people were legally covered, but we do have an inalienable right to equality according to the Declaration of Independence, and also just according to nature. Due process is a really big thing that we hear a lot about right now, and I think it's really interesting that a lot of things in the Constitution were issues that we are currently having with our executive branch. Not respecting the rule of law, not respecting our inalienable rights, not respecting due process. So it's really important to know where these ideas come from, right? So that when we talk about due process, when we talk about representation, when we talk about self-governance, we have the basis, right? What is the equal understanding that we all have? So I am going to wrap up. You can find a whole PDF about how to deal with the Texas legislature, which is starting up again at the end of this month on the website. We'll put it up in a second. And you can find a place on the website to register to vote with League of Women Voters. Austin, if you have not checked recently, if you're registered to vote at the right address, please check, because there's an election coming up outside of Houston on November 4th. And then we have the midterms next year. And we will continue as an organization to create First Amendment events, civics educational events. We're passing out Know Your Rights cards here today, and you can find them on our website. You can find them in our newsletters. Make sure that everyone you know knows how to participate in government, right? And that is, it's really up to what kind of time you have, what kind of passion you have, what you're interested in doing. You can do everything from run to office to go down and talk to your city employees every 2 weeks. You can be a commissioner, which is a volunteer civic governance position, where you basically go onto the website of your city and you apply to work on a specific group of people that makes recommendations to the city on how to manage things. And please get on a first name basis with staffers in offices at every level of government. That's all we got for you today. Tomorrow we will have a live stream yoga class from 2 to 2:45. This is specifically for everyone who is very stressed out right now, but also for people who are flood impacted or are volunteers. Because there's a lot of cortisol and adrenals running through our systems. We don't want to dump it. And we are still raising funds for mutual aid for people who are flood impacted. I also want to note that we have a National Day of Action on Thursday. That is Texas Makes Good Trouble, and we have a phenomenal lineup of speakers. It's going to be at Pan Am. That's on our website as well. Make sure everybody you know comes out, because we have so many very cool organizations who are resistance focused and civil rights focused and self-government focused. So you can come out, plug in to do your civic duty and to self-govern. You can find the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and your employees on our website, Hands Off Central Texas, centraltx.org. My name is Sophia Marto. I'm the president of our organization, and thank you very much for self-governance and for participating in our community. All right, thanks folks. That was it for today. We will have a live stream yoga class tomorrow.